Today's participants are Bob Hoekstra, and Tony Grisafi. We join the conversation in the faculty lounge.
You know that that's an exit that you can leave. A stop sign, for instance, the octagonal red sign, even if it doesn't physically have the word stop on it, because we've been enculturated to know that that's what it means, we usually tend to honor and adhere to that. Okay, and what that tells us is that signs in themselves, the relationship between an audience and its sign has to do with how much we know about our culture, how much we've been trained in our culture, the language we use, and how we can identify those. So semiotics as a field looks at that type of a relationship. And one of the things that...
And it's different for different cultures?
It is different from different cultures, and different cultures read signs and create symbol systems a lot differently. There, for instance, in technical communications fields, and I don't immediately know, I don't remember, I think the guy's name was Lee, who published a study. He looked at the difference between technical manuals published in America and technical manuals that were created, for instance, in China. And one of the things that he found was that in America, there was much less an emphasis on higher concept thinking. It was more direct. This is how you use it. Whereas in the Chinese manuals, it was much more symbolic. There were more pictures. There was much more geared toward the symbolic interaction. And a lot of that had to do with the way that their language is already structured, characters and symbols, as opposed to an almost analogous or analog alphabet in the way that we have it, for instance, in the Roman alphabet that we use. So yeah, I mean, these things are cultural to a certain degree. They're not always universal. Maybe the approach to understanding them could be universal, but the signs and systems themselves tend to be culturally indicative. And that's what semiotics does. So in terms of semiotics, if you look at sign systems as text in themselves, with meaning and with referent, then what we're talking about is looking at the digital medium as a kind of semiotics. Does the text online become a different type of sign system, and how then do we read and understand that, both culturally and maybe universally in some particular way? So it's not just merely then an issue of, and this again is the theory in the field, it's not just merely an issue of putting the printed text of Shakespeare onto the net. It's an issue of how do you then take that text, use the medium to its fullest degree to get the most experience out of that text. And that's in some ways the discussion that we're having in this PhD program in text and technology. And it's new. It's new, and it's new because the technology is still new and it's still emerging. And a lot of the work and literature in this field is really only, at this point, I'd say, at the most, 14 years old, if that. I know that Lanham's book was published, I believe, in 1992 or 93. And that's around the time that you start getting these types of media studies being done in terms of the digital environment.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a TV commercial where a professor is standing up in front of his literature class and saying, you know, very few of you will ever have the opportunity to get published. And somebody said, oh, no, we can get published tomorrow because the net's there. Right. I mean, we can all be published on it. In your field, do you look at things like that? I mean, as I worry a lot about the stuff that is being published out there. On the one hand, I understand the freedom of expression and freedom of speech. I also worry a lot about things that take on a life far beyond themselves because they appear to be published and nobody's reviewed them. Nobody's looked at them. They claim statistics that are all made up. Right. But it takes on a life of its own, and then it stays out there. Is that part of the field that you look at in this digital media thing as well?
Yeah, that is part of the field, and that's interesting you bring that up because I'm an editor-in-chief for an online journal. I've started a journal called Outside the Frame, and it's called Outside the Frame, a journal for text and technology. And that's one of the things that I've been very conscious about. We've actually created an online journal that has a peer review board to look over articles and to make sure that they adhere to that type of a standard. That is a seminal question, and that's another one of the fields that you can go into and look at in this particular discipline. And there are people, for instance, such as Mark Poster, who another person in our field. He works in English, but he talks about digital publishing and the perils of that. That on the one hand, the net is an interesting place because anybody can say what they want. On the other hand, the net is a pitfall because you can say anything you want. A good example of this, I teach Composition 1 to the freshmen who come into the university. And one of the things that they
That must be an interesting experience anyway. Because
it is. But one of the things that they do now that they have been so, especially for the last 5 to 8 years, they have had access to this technology. They come into it thinking that the net is a place for them to get information. And that's some of the things that they do. They get information anywhere they can. And I'll give you a good example. I had a very bright student in my Comp 1 class. It was in the fall of last year. She was doing a paper, and she was doing a paper on racial differences in some way. I can't remember the subject, but she went to a website where she got these supposed statistics about the nature of hate crimes and how they were unfair against whites, right? Well, it turned out the website that she got it from, and she was completely unaware of it, was a white supremacist website. And when I pointed it out to her, she couldn't tell. And the website itself was constructed in such a way that its ideology wasn't immediately known. It just looked like every other type of website. Those are the kinds of things, then that's exactly what, in some ways, that's an egregious example of what you're getting at, that there's information out there that not only is completely biased, but probably fabricated, and how do you tell the difference? That is a big problem. How do you tell the difference? One of the things that you have to do then is to start figuring out how do you teach these digital media standards. How do you then get people to be able to evaluate information that they find? And that's another step in that sort of critical thinking process.
I find that is a major problem I'm working with graduate students.
Right.
Because they've come up through this whole process. And in engineering, they don't do as much writing as I think they should. Right. So I get them in as graduate students and send them off to do papers. And they come back with, first thing I do is try and tell them where the library is located, because most of them have no clue.
Right.
And almost see no need to go there. Well, I have my computer, I'll just go look it up. And so I see that in terms of university-wide being a major problem. And that's one of the things that your field it's
text
again,
and technology.
Text and technology, but it's in the English
Right.
department. That's one of the things that you go after. And then there's also the whole culture thing that we were talking about a little earlier. Marshall McLuhan
Right.
and
people like Lanham or Landau or Poster. These are just theorists.
that
we tend
the
to
medium
rely upon.
is the message.
Right.
And so our medium here is the digital medium.
Yes.
And what other forms?
Well, I mean, there are other forms. For instance, if you can look at film as the medium. And so there are some people in our department who are doing film studies and taking a look at how
Film I don't see as digital. They're claiming it because it's now DV type.
Right. Again,
I'm an old film guy, so I want to see the celluloid,
Yeah, well, I mean, me too. I prefer sitting in an editing room and actually cutting the thing together myself in that way as well. But one of the things then you take a look at is how the digital environment is either interacting with film. Is it? Well, here's a categorical area that people are working in. It's called celluloid versus digital. What is the difference between the medium of celluloid, versus the digital environment?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is all the special effects, and it's getting harder and harder to tell
what's real and what's not on screen. Exactly. A friend of mine, again, in the program did an interesting paper where he took a look at a very small scene in The Phantom Menace, the Star Wars Episode 1 film. And what he did was he pointed out that it's a long proacted scene in which the background is of a little hut that's on this desert planet, right? And what he pointed out was that the hut itself, the scene is something like 2 minutes long. The hut, though, is really only about 3 seconds. And what they did was they took that image and they looped it over and over again so that they can keep the continuity of the image there. And he starts to go into how that in some ways is a different relationship in the way that special effects are being created for film. That image really, not only is it never there, but the continual looping of it itself, what you're really seeing is that film loop over. And he starts to work in things like that.
And this might not be in your field, but does that create certain imprinting? I mean, when you see something over and over again, even though it's at a subconscious level, do you start focusing on it? Does it become more important to you because it's a repeated image?
Well, that's what he was looking at, and that's in some ways, I think, a field of what he's trying to do in terms of a dissertation. Does that looping make that kind of an imprint or an impact psychologically? That isn't my field, but that is, I think, in some ways what he's working on as well. And that's one of the questions that comes out of this particular discipline.
Well, let's get back to your field because I still don't understand what it is. Let's try again.
All of these things are indicative of the field of text and technology, because what we're taking a look at here are the rhetorical contexts for which information is being constructed within or created within in terms of this new digital environment and the electronic technology that's emerging. So if you're asking me specifically what my field is, my field of interest is to take a look at the digital rhetoric of online text.
So now, define rhetoric for me.
Okay. Rhetoric can be defined in the way that I'm using it in two ways. First off, in its general categorical way, which is the persuasive or effective use of language. Second, rhetoric is the understanding of the context for which language is actually used within. Okay. So on the one hand, when somebody gets up and gives a speech about, okay, you should or should not vote for this particular bill, or you should or should not elect me as president, or whatever, they're trying to use language in an effective and persuasive manner. Now, it's kind of weird to see somebody, for instance, at a Burger King getting up and saying to people, hey, how about voting for me for president, although it might happen. Usually that happens in a particular rhetorical context, say at a rally or a particular convention. And that's the other thing that we look at. The place and the space and the physical atmosphere for which the rhetoric, the language, or the message is constructed within. Okay. So
how that affects people in a different way.
Exactly. The dynamics, for instance, of the audience in the relation to the rhetor, in the relation to the message, what they're hearing, what they're understanding, and how they're reacting to it. How the rhetor or speaker or constructor of the message is deliberately constructing the appeals in order to pull the audience or to make that impact on the audience. So when we talk about digital rhetoric, what I'm taking a look at is the digital environment as that context.
All right. Now, digital environment would be the internet as one form of it, or that's many forms of it? What is digital environment?
Well, the digital environment in some ways has to do with the electronic medium, the computer in some ways itself. Now, you can take a look at the internet as the digital environment or one part of it. But for instance, one of the things that we've been seeing a lot of recently are multimedia CD-ROM software that's coming with the textbooks on campus, right?
Okay, sure.
That's another digital environment altogether.
Okay.
So you can look at it in that way, in that it's not just merely the internet, but it's also, in some ways, anything that could interface with the electronic computer environment somehow. And
then you're looking at how people respond to that in the environment. So it's how does the digital medium affect the way that they hear the message? The way that
we read the message and understand it, yeah.
Isn't this psychology?
To a certain degree it might be, sure, but it's also an idea of rhetoric study, because what we're really looking at, or what I'm specifically looking at, is the construction of these messages in connection with rhetorical principles. For instance, looking at, say, Stephen J. Toulmin, who is a philosopher and who deals with language. He set up a system for understanding the structure of arguments based on claims, reasons, and warrants. The idea that there's a value underneath all of our argumentative statements, and what we're really looking at in terms of rhetoric are the cultural values that people appeal to in order to get their message across. So in some ways what I look at in terms of the digital environment are how these messages are constructed, to appeal to particular audiences. And you can look at that in everything from, again, say an online addition to Homer, Shakespeare, or just traditional literature, or for instance the construction of, well, here's a good example. The OrlandoSentinel.com, right? Mm-hmm. Which basically are the same articles that you see every day in the paper itself, but they've been remediated to be put online in such a way that the user who goes to this website can interface with it easily and accessibly. The information is constructed in such a way that you can link to it, you can get to it pretty directly, you can even search through the archives and find older articles and whatnot. So it becomes in some ways a database and a catalog of this as an event. That's in some ways one of the things that we take a look at, how these websites construct and create their information so that they catalog them and they also make them accessible to the public in the digital way, as opposed to just merely in the print.
But it isn't so much the way that they create the database, because that seems like computer science guys figuring out how to create. You're more interested in how people are going to respond to that stuff that's in the database.
Right, exactly, and what the implications of that are. Something, for instance, like OrlandoSentinel.com probably doesn't have a whole lot of larger cultural implications because it's so close to the print medium that it replicates.
Yeah.
But now when we start getting into other types of, say, websites or other types of digital media, then the question then becomes...
Can you give me an example so I can make this jump with you?
Okay, let me see. I'm trying to think of a good one. There's an online, what's called an online novel called From Lexia to Perplexia, in which...
And this is a reputable novel, it's not...
Well, it's understood to be an online novel, and there are people who are studying what it is and how it works at this point in time.
Okay, all right.
But the big thing is that...
It wasn't somebody in their basement that just created something.
No, but it's... The thing, though, is that it uses, for instance, database relations. It uses dynamic web pages as a means of creating a digital experience. The story itself, it's almost not really a story as much as the whole point of it is for the user to get involved with wandering around the space of the internet, or the space that the internet provides in terms of a narrative experience. So again,
interesting.
When you click on something on this page, it takes you somewhere. And depending upon where you click on, again, that changes the experience that you have of the narrative that you're looking at.
And every person, because it's probably large, is going to end up with a different experience in the reading of this novel.
Exactly. And those are the kinds of things that we're looking at. How does that catch on? How does that then appeal to a larger audience, if it does? Does it not appeal to a larger audience at all?
And does that larger audience get any kind of a message at all because it's so scattered?
Yeah, or do they get a message at all because they can't, or they cannot actually understand the semiosis that's involved? This is a new sign system for us right now. We've never seen this before. This stands outside of our range of experience at this moment, okay? And that's the thing that we're looking at. How then does this become a part of the range of our experience? More than just merely using the net to, as a search engine, but rather using the net as a form of creating cultural experiences. So that's one of the things that I look at in terms of this digital rhetorical environment. What are the experiences, in some ways, of the message that's being created, if it is being created?
I hear you talking about it in terms of language. What about other kinds of images? Do you get into that? I mean, this is a whole art medium as well.
Absolutely, yeah. There's a clear line of aesthetics that are involved in this as well, visual, auditory, and that becomes a whole nother discussion about the digital text. So your initial question concerning text, have we gone beyond it? That becomes a part of this as well. From Lexia to Perplexia has sound images or sound files to it as well that you have to be able to listen to in order to get the full effect. So when you see an animation on the net, in some ways, we have to ask, how is that animation actually contributing to the construction of the message as well? Excuse me. And that's the fun with trying to define this digital text, because if we look at text as merely print, it really fails us. But what we then need to do is to look at the digital text in all of its forms, in the multiplicity of the multimedia experience that it can provide. And that's when I said to you earlier about, now what we need to do is to take Shakespeare and really put it into the digital environment to figure out a way to make that text become even more animated, so that somebody who gets it can experience in some kind of way. That's a big thing in the field.
When you're saying field, I have this sense that this field is made up. If you had a convention, you'd have a hard time getting 5 people together.
Oh, you'd be surprised. MIT is publishing at least 30 titles a year concerning this subject, and so is Duke University Press and University of Minnesota. So I mean, these are major publishing houses that recognize that there is something going on. It's just the problem is that you're right. I mean, the big problem is that we just haven't really labeled it in some kind of substantive way, except for what we've done at UCF. In text and technology, and the English department created a PhD program in text and technology to study all of this, to see if there is a way to codify it into some kind of a realistic discipline that can be taught and understood even. Because at this point in time, there's just way too much literature and way too much research and just way too much work in it to really abuse it, to say, there's no value to it. Because there are people, for instance, who are looking at technology in a very even functional way. People, for instance, like Cynthia Self, who looks at how to use the technology to teach composition, how to use the technology to teach people how to write, or how can we create technology to help people how to write. And that sounds more almost like an industry, but it is. I mean, it's grounded in some sound principles of how do you get students to interact with the technology so that the feedback comes to them and they learn from it.
That's whole distance learning. You've just gone over into the education department, and I would think there are people over there looking at the same thing.
And there are people who are taking PhDs in this program who are doing that as well. There's one young lady in the program who is looking at how to use technology from K to 12 in terms of interactive storytelling and whatnot. So again, you're right. So what we're talking about is an interdisciplinary program that really does begin to put its feelers out to other fields. And we're trying to define exactly what this is. And it's problematic because many of us in the program are really on our own concerning that. We have so much to choose from.
And you're going to be on your own once you get your PhD, to some extent.
I don't know about that, because I think that no matter what we think or what we like about the technology to a certain degree, I mean, it is changing the way that we think about education. And there needs to be some sort of both high-end abstract evaluation all the way to a practical evaluation of its uses in this field, because otherwise we're going to suffer the problems that you pointed out with the net that we already suffer. We're going to have a whole lot of information that we don't have any clue of what to do with, how to understand it, how to even use it. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, that's one of the reasons, for instance, why the library takes great standards in terms of its digitized information, that they buy, for instance, CD-ROMs, and they subscribe to reputable publishing houses that we can access, for instance, information online like that. How do we create these standards? How do we maintain them? How do we make sure that they're being used in a way that will give users, the maximum experience that they can in terms of accessing information?
Most people that do a PhD have an intention of going to a college university to teach.
Right.
You're in a field that is truly an emerging field.
Right.
Where do you do this? I mean, you do it at UCF, but where else? Are there places that, I mean, is this going to become an exploding field? This is going to become a major part of the English field in the next few years? Do you see that happening? Or is this going to be a little very small niche area that a few universities will focus on, and it really won't?
Well, it's already in some ways a small niche area that a few universities are focusing in on. MIT,
but will it stay there?
Well, that's the question, and that's an interesting thing. For instance, there is a kind of a program not like this, but I mean, the English department again at MIT does a lot of this work as well, and you've got people there.
I'm surprised that, excuse me for being flip, but MIT having an English department.
I know, sounds kind of strange, but they really do. But this is again some of the things that they're working with as well. So I think there actually is there's a program actually, and I don't remember if it's University of UCLA or somewhere out in California, that looked at our program and said, that's real interesting. We want to start something like that out here as well. The real thing to look at is how this program is going to innovate the field, and the fact is that we are innovating the field. The students who are in this particular program are producing projects that, are as far as much of the Inc. studies in terms of humanities and arts and science is incredibly interesting.
In most PhD programs, and I assume in this one, there are a set of required courses, right, and then there are some elective courses, and then, of course, the heart of it is your dissertation, right, research on it. where do these required in elective courses come from? I mean, you're saying it's interdisciplinary. Are there specialty courses that you can take, or are the students themselves becoming the experts and really beyond where the professors can help them?
We have core required classes. The three main, for instance, that everybody has to take is a research methods course, a history course, and then a theory in TNT. Those are the three majors, and I think they're actually adding a fourth one. TNT? Text and technology.
Okay.
That's what we call it.
Yeah, sure.
The research methods course ranges from quantitative, how to do limited quantitative analysis stuff, to how to actually look at humanities research. The history of TNT is exactly that. I mean, it actually details a history of the development of electronic technology from the 19th century to where we are even today. And then the theories course is it's a much more, it's a pretty in-depth and abstract take a look at the philosophies and certain practical theories concerning what TNT is and what it could become. These are standards that were set down by the department, because you have to have at least those three major fields in order to be able to perform research in the field.
Sure.
And then the elective courses come from it's not the students creating them, but they've come from the faculty themselves as well. And the faculty are creating certain types of courses as they learn and they develop what it is that this field may be. So one of the elective courses that I took was a cultural context in text and technology, where that's what we studied. And Dr. Saper, who I took it with, who's also the coordinator of the TNT program, he had us take a look at certain theories of text and technology, and then we had to create a digital project in some way that would actually apply in a sort of real life situation. We've had courses, for instance, that dealt with usability, text and technology, looking at web design and usability. We've had classes that have been even more interesting, taking a look at such things as cultural construct of gender in terms of online environments.
Do you go outside the department for a lot of your courses as
well?
Yeah,
you can actually go outside the department. So for instance, we have some of our elective courses come from the psychology department. You can go in there and you can take courses in human factors and behavioral theory, and that'll actually apply. You can take classes in the film